The church bell tolls, not for celebration but for shame. A woman in a torn wedding dress stands alone in the mud, veil heavy with insult, eyes dry with defiance. They called her too much, too strong, too stubborn to love. The preacher walks away, the crowd jeers, and on the ridge, a stranger watches, silent as a storm about to break. In a town built on pride and silence, what happens when the one they tried to break refuses to kneel? Before we reveal what made a bride stand her ground beneath a jeering sky, what secret was sealed inside her father's anvil, and how a single act of mercy turned a whole town against itself, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories of the frontier, they're reckonings, hammered in fire and tempered by grace. Your support keeps the forge burning for the voices history tried to silence. One click helps the truth keep ringing. Thank you for standing beside her in the heat. The church bell swung on rusted hinges, its mournful toll cracking through the dust-choked wind that rolled over the parched earth like judgment. A thunderhead loomed on the horizon, deep violet and swollen with rain it refused to give. Beneath the church's faded steeple, the crowd had gathered not in reverence, but in appetite. Boots shifted in dry gravel. Children whispered behind skirts. Men leaned on posts, arms crossed, smirks thin as blades. In the center of it all stood Mara Clay. Her wedding dress, once white, now clung to her in shreds, lace torn, hem soaked in mud. The bodice stretched where it had been grabbed, ripped, spat on. Her veil trailed behind her like a banner in defeat. Blood clung to one corner of her lip. She didn't wipe it away. Her hands were still clenched at her sides, cracked from work, scarred from the forge. The preacher stood a step above her on the warped wooden platform, Bible trembling in his hands. He looked at the man beside him, Deputy Harlan Coyne, then back at Mara, then down at the dust. His voice caught in his throat. Silence. Harlan spat at her feet. "You think you can hammer steel and still be someone's wife?" he said, loud enough for the whole town to hear. Too heavy to lift, too proud to kneel. A ripple of cruel laughter rolled through the crowd. Mara didn't move. She stared at the preacher, at the book in his hands, at the step between them that no one dared to close. Her eyes were dark, not from shadow but resolve, and she didn't look away even when the preacher turned. He stepped down. He walked past her without a word. Harlan scoffed, adjusted the tin star on his chest, and smoothed his shirt like he was dusting off guilt. Then he walked too. The crowd lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for her to cry, to plead, to crumble. She gave them none of it. When they finally dispersed, the bell still echoed faintly in the distance, like a wound that refused to close. And far above the town, on the ridge beyond the cemetery, a figure watched from horseback. Dust curled around the stallion's hooves. The rider wore a dark coat cinched against the wind, his face shadowed beneath a broad hat pulled low. A rifle rested across his saddle, a bandolier crossed his chest. His jaw worked slowly, eyes narrowed. He had been riding for days, looking for someone. And now he'd found her. Below, Mara knelt in the dirt, not in surrender, but to pick up the veil, to brush it off, to fold it carefully. Her fingers moved with the same quiet strength she used to fold hot iron. The voice came not from the crowd, not from the rider, but from something older, an echo threading through dust and dusk, like the land itself remembering. Every town's got its sins buried shallow. The sky cracked once with dry thunder, and the stranger kicked his horse into a slow descent. The morning sun cut through the mountain haze in long, copper bands, casting molten light across the yard behind the forge. Ash hung in the air like slow-moving snow, and the clang of hammer on steel rang steady and true, sharp, rhythmic, relentless. Sparks leapt from the anvil as Mara Clay drove heat into shape, her arms bare to the shoulder, muscles taut and glistening with sweat, each swing exact, deliberate, grounded in the quiet force of someone who didn't need to prove her strength, only apply it. The forge had belonged to her father, once the only blacksmith between Dust Hollow and Lockridge. He'd taught her to temper iron the way some fathers taught boys to throw a punch or hold a gun. But now he was gone, buried with the same hands that had taught hers to swing, lift, pour, shape. The anvil still bore his initials, half-worn. The shop still smelled of smoke, sweat, and cedar. She wore his apron, now singed and blackened at the edges, the leather stiff but familiar. Her dark hair was pulled back with a length of horseshoe wire. Her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were bright, alert, always scanning the shape of things, not just metal, but weather, tension, unspoken things in the people who passed by. At the edge of the shop, 3 children crouched behind a rain barrel, peeking in with eyes wide. They'd been there for nearly an hour, watching her shape a broken plowshare into something new, smoother, sharper, purposeful again. She knew they were there, she let them stay. She liked the silence of watchers who didn't ask foolish questions. The metal hissed as she plunged it into the quenching trough, steam curling around her arms. She lifted it with tongs, inspecting the edge. Her mother used to say, you could tell a soul by the way someone looked at the work they'd just finished, whether they saw it as done, or as part of something still unfinished. Mara always looked for what came next. A merchant passed by the open doors, slowing just enough to be heard. Shame, that, he said, eyeing her arms, thick with muscle and flecked with tiny scars. You'd be a handsome wife if you weren't built like a damn ox. Mara didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She laid the blade down gently on the rack and began preparing the next piece, an iron hinge for the church gate. The merchant lingered, as if waiting for her to bite, to bark, to break the silence with heat. But she only began to hum a slow tune, low and familiar, the same one her mother had sung during storm season, when wind clawed at the shutters and thunder growled like something pacing just beyond the hills. The merchant muttered something and walked off, boots crunching over dry gravel. Mara kept humming. She liked that song. It was about storms that came, made a mess of things, then passed on. The sky that day was cloudless, but the air held pressure, heavy, waiting. Behind the children, far across the open fields, a single cloud gathered on the ridgeline, thick, dark, watching. And though she didn't look up, Mara knew the sound that followed, a long, distant roll of thunder, low, like a warning whispered into the earth. The horse came in limping, foam at the mouth, hooves caked in blood and gravel, one eye rolling white. Its rider was slumped low in the saddle, more weight than will, swaying like a scarecrow in the wind. The animal staggered into the edge of town just after sundown, its shadow long and broken across the dirt road. People watched from porches and thresholds, from behind curtains and whiskey glasses. No one stepped forward. Not until the horse finally collapsed in the dust, and the man crumpled with it, hitting the ground hard, unmoving. Mara was at the edge of the square, her apron still streaked with soot from a long day at the forge. She dropped the bucket she was carrying before it reached the trough, and her boots were already pounding against the packed earth before anyone else had even moved. Someone muttered her name as she passed. Another shook his head. A woman pulled her child back from the window and whispered, "That's a bounty man. That's blood on his boots." Mara knelt beside him, hands already at work. The man was tall and lean under the dust and dried sweat, his coat torn, shoulders soaked dark, where something had opened deep. A bullet wound, maybe, or something worse. His face was sunburned, angular, half hidden beneath a layer of grime and stubble. His gun belt was worn, well used, but his hands were limp, one still clinging weakly to the reins. "He needs a doctor," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We need trouble like we need a fire in the wheat," someone called back. No one moved. Mara looked up, eyes hard. "Then pray he doesn't die here." She hoisted him under the arms, dragging him off the road toward her workshop. Her muscles burned, but she didn't slow. A few followed with their eyes. Most didn't bother. Why's she helping a killer? Came the question, half hissed, half gasped, like someone hoping to be overheard. She laid him out on her workbench, pushing aside tools and iron filings, then cleaned the wound with boiled water and what little whiskey she had left. She stitched in silence, jaw clenched, hands steady. Outside, the town held its breath, uncertain whether to be impressed or afraid. By dawn, the worst of the fever had passed. Light filtered in through the high windows, catching on the dust that still hung in the air. Elias Ward stirred, his brow twitching first, then his fingers. When he opened his eyes, they locked on the woman sitting beside him, elbows on her knees, head bowed in sleep. Her arms were streaked with grease and dried blood. Her shirt clung to her collarbone, still damp from sweat. He shifted and winced. She looked up fast, alert, reaching for water. "You the one they call the Anvil girl?" he asked, voice like rusted wire. She didn't smile. "That's what they call me," she said. "Not who I am." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked. Then closed his eyes again, like he finally trusted something in this godless place. Outside, the town was already awake, but no one knocked on her door. Not yet. Not until they figured out what kind of storm she'd just let in. The days that followed passed like smoke, visible, acrid, impossible to hold. Word spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. Whispers grew into warnings, and warnings into threats veiled behind church hymns and council speeches. Mara couldn't walk across the square without hearing her name clipped and bitten off in fragments. Sleeping with danger. Inviting blood into the basin. She was always strange, but now she's begging for ruin. No one confronted her directly. They rarely did. But eyes lingered longer. Doors closed sooner. And at every corner, something was being said just loud enough to be heard. The town council came to her under the pretense of civility, 5 men in boiled wool and clean boots, standing in her workshop like it offended them just to breathe in the soot. Councilman Reeves spoke for them, a man whose smile had always been too quick and too empty. "This isn't about judgment," he said, resting his hands on her father's anvil, like it belonged to him. "It's about order, about the good of the town." Mara said nothing. She leaned against the forge, arms folded, sweat still drying on her throat. "You've got a wounded bounty man under your roof, a killer by trade. And now folks are wondering when the folks he's hunted come for him. Are they coming through our streets? He hasn't hurt anyone here." Reeves gave a patient sigh. "Yet. You know how this goes. Blood brings more blood. And you know how fast this place burns when someone strikes steel." Her eyes flicked to the councilman's boots. Not a speck of dust among them. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. They left soon after, saying they hoped she'd make the right choice. Which meant the convenient one. Which meant obedience. That afternoon, Harlan came. He didn't knock. He walked into the yard like he owned it, like he still had some claim. Same badge, same boots, same narrow shoulders in a too stiff deputy's coat. His hat was low over his eyes, but not low enough to hide the smirk. "Heard you're nursing a stray," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Didn't take you for the merciful type. But maybe I misremembered. Been a while, after all." Mara kept her hands on the hammer she was oiling. She didn't look up. "I'm telling you this once," he continued, voice tightening. "You send him out, or I bring men to do it for you. That's the law." She looked at him then. Really looked. "Since when did the law start wearing your insecurities like a uniform?" He stepped closer, the charm gone now, mask cracking. "You were always too much for me," he snapped. "Too strong, too loud, too stubborn. But for him, you're too low." Behind him, from the shadows of the doorway, a figure stirred. Elias Ward stood there, shirt half buttoned, bandage fresh across his shoulder. His jaw was set like stone. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The look was enough. The same look a dog gives before it breaks the leash. Harlan's bravado shrank by a measure. He tipped his hat, backed out slow, and disappeared down the road. By dusk, the sound of boots began circling the property, one set, then two, then more. Not marching, but waiting. Not lawmen, not militia, just men. Men with opinions and fear and idle hands. Their silence pressed against the walls like rising water. Mara stood at the window, hands wrapped in cloth, watching the figures gather at the edges of her land. Behind her, Elias sat sharpening a knife, not out of threat, but preparation. There was no war cry. No speeches. Just a sense that something was about to snap. Outside, the air held the weight of stormlight. Not a drop had fallen, but the clouds were gathering fast. The night arrived, not quietly, but with breath held behind doors and shutters nailed shut. Wind carried dust through the narrow alleys of Bell River, lifting old prayers from the chapel eaves and mixing them with the smoke of fresh-lit torches. Shadows flickered against clapboard walls, stretched long and violent across the square. The mob did not come with order or structure, they came with certainty. That dangerous kind. The kind that doesn't ask questions because it's already choking on answers. They marched slow, boots stomping in broken rhythm, picking up more weight with every step. Men who had never spoken to each other outside of Sunday services now stood shoulder to shoulder, mouths tight, fists clenched, voices raised. At the back of the line rode Sheriff Danvers, his horse calm despite the fevered air. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched. Mara saw the glow of torches from her window before she heard the crowd. She pressed her hand to the sill, feeling the low rumble under her palm like a train in the distance, like thunder before it rolls over the ridge. Behind her, Elias stood at the forge, freshly bandaged and already slipping bullets into his revolver with practiced ease. He moved without panic, slow, measured, but his jaw was locked and his eyes had gone cold. "They're not coming to talk," he said. "I know. They're not coming to ask. I know." Elias holstered the revolver. "Then let me meet them." But Mara stepped in front of him. She reached out, not to stop him with force, but with something older. Something rooted in choice. "If we answer violence with more," she said quietly, "we don't prove them wrong, we become their reason." Elias looked at her then, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who had drawn her own line long before he arrived. Outside, the crowd slowed as they reached the edge of her yard. Flames shimmered in the reflection of her windows. A few voices jeered, others shouted. Some names were called, none were hers. She opened the door and stepped out alone. Mara Clay stood on her porch in the same singed apron she wore at the forge, hands bare, no weapon at her side. The wind caught the hem of her skirt, but she didn't flinch. The torchlight made her look like iron cooling slowly, still hot, but unbroken. "If kindness makes me guilty," she called out, voice steady and clear, "then take me now." The words silenced them. For a moment, even the fire seemed to still. She stepped down into the dust. "Would you burn your own for the comfort of your pride?" she asked. Her eyes swept the faces. Some looked away, some held firm. One man dropped his torch. It hit the dirt with a soft hiss. The sheriff didn't move. Not forward, not back. No one crossed the line. Above them, the wind began to howl long and low, like a warning through the canyons. Stark and burning in silence. "Would you stand with her?" Morning came gray and reluctant, bleeding slowly through the clouds like it was ashamed of the night before. The torches had burned themselves to ash, leaving only black scars in the dirt and the faint smell of soot on the wind. The mob had scattered before dawn, not all at once, but in trickles, like guilt washing away pride. Some left in silence, heads bowed. Others lingered longer, hoping someone else would make the first retreat. In the end, even the sheriff rode off without a word, his hat low, his silence louder than any command he might have given. Mara didn't sleep. She sat by the forge through the night, her back to the wall, watching the coals die down and listening for footsteps that never came. Elias sat nearby, his revolver untouched on the table beside him, though the tension hadn't fully left his shoulders. When the sun finally breached the distant hills, it found them both awake, quiet, still standing. By mid-morning, Elias walked into the mayor's office with the same calm he carried into a gunfight. The room smelled of old paper and cheap tobacco, sunlight slanting through the blinds in pale stripes. Mayor Langley looked up from behind his cluttered desk, his expression as guarded as it was surprised. He'd expected Mara, maybe. A councilman. Not the bounty hunter who had become the center of town gossip overnight. Elias didn't sit. He reached into his coat and unfolded a worn sheet of parchment with creases so deep it looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. He laid it on the desk. Langley leaned forward, his brow furrowing. It was a wanted poster. But the face wasn't Elias's. It was Mara's father. Langley blinked. Jude Clay's been dead near 5 years. I know, Elias said. And he died a thief in the eyes of this town. But the charges were wrong, forged, set up to take the fall for a man who needed a scapegoat with calloused hands and no one to speak for him. The mayor's lips parted, but no words came. Elias pointed to a small line at the bottom of the poster, mostly overlooked. Testimony sealed, one name redacted in local records, but not in federal ones. The witness that could have cleared him? He looked Langley in the eye. His daughter. She was a child then, but she saw more than she realized. Langley sat back slowly, hands folding in front of him. The marshal sent you? Elias nodded. To find the only living witness who could testify to the fraud that sent 3 good men to the grave and cost the government more than coin. They were tracking the wrong story for too long, but I followed it here. Langley looked stunned. So why didn't you say something when you got into town? Elias's voice was calm, but sharp around the edges. Because sometimes you need to see who a person is before you tell them why they matter. Outside, church bells rang not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but for the hour. A clean, ordinary sound. But to Mara Clay, standing at her forge and looking out across the empty yard where a mob had once stood, it sounded different now. It sounded like something beginning. The stagecoach rolled into Bell River just before noon, its wheels groaning beneath the weight of dust, iron, and authority. The driver cracked the reins, but the horses slowed on their own, as if they too felt the weight of the man inside. When the coach door opened, the first thing that hit the crowd was the glint of the badge. The second was the man behind it. Marshal Silas Yates stepped down with boots polished and coat pressed, every button gleaming in the high sun. He was tall, square-shouldered, with silver at his temples, and a gaze like a noose tightening with each glance, looking for weakness, for guilt. He didn't need to raise his voice. The mere shift of his eyes was command enough. People made room before he asked. Children were ushered inside. Doors that had once swung freely now creaked closed. He didn't stop at the saloon, didn't pause at the council hall. He walked straight to the center of town, where Elias stood in front of the smithy, waiting. Hands loose, eyes steady, no gun in sight. Mara stood beside him, chin high, arms streaked with ash. The forge behind her was still warm. The townsfolk gathered slowly, pulled by the gravity of the moment. A few still clutched yesterday's torches in trembling fingers. Others brought their silence like shields. The church bell tolled once no announcement, no service. Just sound, deep and cold and final. Marshal Yates stopped a few paces from Elias and stared long and hard before speaking. Elias Ward. You're charged with impersonating a federal officer, obstruction of justice, and misappropriation of state orders. Murmurs rippled like cracks in dry stone. Elias didn't blink. I had orders, signed and sealed. Yates pulled a leather folio from his coat and opened it slowly. Then explain why the name on the seal isn't yours. Mara stepped forward. He was sent to find me. Yates turned to her, not unkindly, but with the coldness of a man used to burying truth beneath layers of process. Mara Clay, you are under suspicion of harboring a fugitive and withholding evidence relevant to a federal investigation. You sent him. I sent no one bearing that name, which means he's not who he claimed. And you, his eyes narrowed, may have known more than you let on. Deputy Harlan stepped out from the crowd then, too quick, too proud, handing over iron cuffs with an eagerness that turned stomachs. Yates took them without ceremony. Elias offered no resistance, as his wrists were bound. I came here to uncover a lie, Elias said. And I found a town built to protect it. Yates nodded once. That's what trials are for. The marshal turned to the gathering crowd. There will be a hearing tomorrow. Evidence will be presented. Truth will be tested. Mara's jaw clenched. Her fists tightened at her sides, the muscles in her forearms twitching like drawn wire, but she said nothing. Not yet. Not in this square. Not with the gallows of judgment already rising in the minds around her. As the townsfolk dispersed, the bell tolled again. Not like before, not with ceremony or rhythm. This time, it sounded like something forgotten being remembered. Like something buried clawing its way back up through the roots. A reckoning had come to Bellriver. And it wasn't riding a horse. It wore a badge. And it didn't care who it broke, only that something cracked. The town square never felt quieter, not even on Sundays. Dust swirled in the air like it didn't want to settle. The people of Bellriver had come not to witness justice, they were long past believing in such things, but to see which story would finally buckle under the weight of truth. The gallows stood unfinished at the edge of the chapel wall, boards raw and waiting. The marshal stood still as stone beneath the church steps. Elias remained cuffed beside him, though his eyes burned with something that refused to be silenced. And then came the sound. The slow, heavy rhythm of hammer on metal. Mara Clay walked alone from her forge, dragging something behind her. The crowd parted, reluctant and hushed, as she passed. Her hands were black with soot, her hair tied back with a strip of linen soaked in sweat. Behind her trailed her father's anvil, old, scorched, scarred with years of labor. She had welded it shut herself after his death, sealed it to keep rust and memory from bleeding out. But now it rolled through the square like a tombstone on wheels. She reached the platform, looked Marshal Yates square in the eye, and said, "This town never cared about truth. Just whose voice shouted loudest." Yates nodded once. "So show us." She took a breath, then another. She raised her hammer, and the first strike rang out like thunder. Sparks flared into the midday light. The second blow cracked through the silence. On the third, a thin seam split down the side of the anvil, just enough for smoke to curl from within. Gasps rose from the crowd, and some stepped back as if the truth might burn them on contact. Mara dropped the hammer and reached into the glowing slit. Her leather gloves sizzled against the metal, but she didn't stop. She pulled free a small, scorched bundle wrapped in oilcloth and bound with wire. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it, then steadied. Inside was the ledger her father's, as precise and careful as the day he'd hidden it. The ink was faded, but the numbers were still legible. And so were the names. She turned the book to the crowd, pages open for all to see. Debts, bribes, every coin that bought silence in this town. Every lie paid for with someone else's life. The mayor stepped forward, face pale, voice thin. That's not proof." Mara met his eyes. "Then explain why your signature's next to the dates my father was accused of stealing. And why funds meant for the railroad wound up in your wife's name." A murmur rolled through the crowd like dry leaves catching fire. Marshal Yates took the ledger, scanned it quickly, then turned to Elias. "You're free." The cuffs hit the wood with a dull clank. Elias didn't move, didn't gloat. He just exhaled and looked at Mara like he'd always known she'd bring the truth down like a hammer. The mayor wobbled, then dropped to one knee, shame outweighing pride. The silence that followed wasn't out of respect, it was exhaustion. The kind that comes after holding your breath for years. Marshal Yates turned to Mara. "What'll you do now, Miss Clay?" She wiped the soot from her brow, the fire still smoldering in her eyes. "Build something that lasts." And with the anvil still cracked open behind her and the whole town watching, she turned and walked back to her forge, not to hide, not to rest, but to begin. The days grew longer, and the forge burned brighter than it had in years. The fire had a new rhythm, now less desperate, more deliberate. Metal met stone with purpose, not defiance. Mara stood at its heart, her sleeves rolled up, apron darkened with soot and sweat, her arms stronger than ever. Children once again gathered at a distance, not in mockery but in awe, watching as she shaped red-hot steel into tools, into hinges, into things that held weight and purpose. Bell River had grown quieter since the day the truth cracked open in the square. The church bell didn't ring as often, and the townsfolk walked with shoulders a little lower, their voices softer around her. They didn't apologize, Mara never expected them to. But they looked her in the eye now, and that was something. Elias lingered. At first, under the guise of helping repair the sheriff's broken fences or hauling wood to the council hall. Then, for no excuse at all, he slept in the bunk behind the stable, cooked breakfast like it was a ritual, and kept his revolver holstered more often than not. Sometimes he joined Mara at the forge, just watching, arms crossed, his face unreadable but calm. On a warm morning streaked with silver mist, he saddled his horse with the quiet determination of someone leaving a place that had carved itself into him. The sky overhead was pale, washed of the bruises it once bore. The forge roared behind them as Mara finished hammering the last rivet into a wagon wheel. Elias mounted up, then turned back, hat in hand. His voice was rough from the road already. "You ever think of leaving this place?" Mara didn't look up at first. She smoothed the curve of the iron with her fingers, ran a cloth over the edge, then straightened. Her face was smudged with ash, but her eyes held a clarity that cut through everything else. "I did," she said, "for years, dreamed of vanishing like a ghost." He waited. She glanced at the horizon, then back at the town behind him. "But why should I be the one to go? Let the ones who judged me see me live, that's the only justice I need." He smiled, not a wide smile, but one that reached somewhere deep. He gave her a nod, adjusted his reins, and turned his horse toward the trail. The hooves clopped gently over the dirt road, fading into the trees. As he disappeared over the ridge, Mara picked up her hammer once more and hummed the old tune, her mother's lullaby about storms passing, about strength hidden in stillness. The song drifted up with the smoke from the chimney, curling through the forge rafters, out across Bell River. And somewhere, a voice rose like wind through dry grass. They called her too heavy for love, said her hands were built for anvils, not affection. But what they never understood was that weight is not a flaw. It's the mark of something meant to carry what others can't. Turns out, she wasn't too much, just more than they were ready for. Would you have stood beside her? Or stayed with the crowd?